Light and architecture is a pretty important relationship, and the work of Schindler and architects like Louis Kahn, I think, really do explore how light and shadow help create and define space. The role of lighting design or light designs within that space I think, is pretty important to set moods. And I do believe in the power of light to create these warm places of interaction and feeling and comfort. My name is Brendan Ravenhill. We are in Echo Park neighborhood of Los Angeles, California, and we are in the 1938 Rudolph Schindler house called Southall Studio. The architect is Rudolph Schindler. He is an Austrian immigrant architect who mostly worked in Los Angeles, and he built this house in 1938, which is about the middle of his career. Schindler was a protege of Frank Lloyd Wright. He studied in Austria originally under Adolf Loos, who was a very big teacher and practitioner of the modern movement in Europe. As I've understood it, saw a portfolio of Frank Lloyd Wright's that had made its way over to Europe and was totally influenced and moved to Chicago to try to work for him. Couldn't hire Schindler for when he first approached Wright, but then after many years when he got a commission to come out to California and then go out to Tokyo, he hired Schindler to kind of come on and be his right-hand man and kind of run his US operation. Schindler moved out here to support the design of the Hollyhock House at Barnesdale Art Park. And it was there that he really had his first hand experimenting and building in the California landscape. Shortly after working on Barnesdale House, built his own house on Kings Road in 1922. Mildred Southall was the original owner of the home, and she was a pianist and piano teacher. So she was part of the East Side intellectual left-wing scene that was popular in the hills of Echo Park and Silver Lake, and she taught music to all the kids of other Schindler houses. She commissioned Schindler to build a house that was a house and a studio. And so it was really, from its first concept plan, different than other houses in that it was always supposed to be her place of business to be able to teach music lessons, have small recitals, and was designed, therefore, with two entrances and kind of two different programs, where one half of the house was more public and open and larger, which is the half that we're in, and the other half of the house was more private and lower and sheltered in some ways. But the house was really a little bit unique in Schindler's style house when he was letting go of his earlier, the steel style movement, which is really known for its more solid volume, a lot of stucco, a lot of just these very kind of plastic-like forms, into a later kind of space architecture style, which is what he's more known for, where he's really looking at the interior spaces and how those spaces house and hold the different programs of the house, less so about how the building looks on the outside, letting that be more of a byproduct of the intentionality of the interior space. The previous owner, who was really only ever the second owner of the house, Kath Gosho, so she had it and she owned it from 1973 or so, and she had it for many, many years, raised her kids here, and had always had a very special connection to the house. She was half Japanese and just felt a lot of this very Eastern influence in the house, and it always had a special place for her. And so she had it and was very emotionally attached to it, but had tried to sell it over the years only to have it fall out of escrow a couple times. Each time she found out afterwards that no matter what the people had promised them, they'd fall out of escrow because they wanted to tear the house down to build a big apartment building on it. And so when my sister-in-law decided to move back east, she mentioned to the owner that we were also looking, to stay and maybe buy a place in the neighborhood. And so the previous owner, Kath, approached us about buying it. And we said, that's all, nice and good, but I'm not sure we can afford it. And she's like, don't worry, when I bought it in a land contract. I'll sell it to you the same way. And she said, land contract is a way that you buy property where even if you can't afford it, the person who sells it to you effectively acts as the bank. And so she gave us a price that seemed kind of high, honestly, at the time, but with very good terms, and that we wouldn't have to put money down, and we could self-finance, and we could afford it as we grew in our careers and as we were able to fix up the house. And so we shook hands. Her mom was the witness. Her mom was 95 at the time. Finally, after 2 years of just wanting to kind of things get more locked down, we did finalize the paperwork for a land contract and had that for another year change before finally buying her outright. In the years that we first moved in, it was animal infested, there was no heat, floors were exposed plywood, some of the appliances didn't work. So we spent those first 3 years, even before we had title on it, just really putting a lot of care and love and renovation into the property so that when we did get, conventional mortgage, it praised for what we had actually agreed to buy it for. And the neighborhood happened to change during that time as well. So. And I think the previous owner also felt that to us, she could trust that it would actually be in good hands. I think that was a very important requirement for her, having almost lost the house a couple of times through the sale. She really wanted someone who was gonna take it over and care for it and raise kids here as she had and look after all her animals that are buried all over the property, So Mildred Southall, when she commissioned the space, as a client, I think she was pretty active in her needs and demands. Obviously convinced Schindler to make the bigger kitchen so that she could have a proper place to cook. But I think she was also very much about building in storage and having these spaces kind of do double duty. So there's a couple wall partitions that are really nothing more than 3/4 inch pieces of plywood that allow whole rooms to disappear. And that flexibility has actually been very lovely as we've occupied the house. When we first moved in here, we ran our design studio out of the space, and we were able to use that, what is now our bedroom, as our design space. And when we ran out of space, we were able to dissolve the walls and expand into the nursery, and then we had that space functioning for many years as a design space. And that ability to shift and expand spaces, I think, is it's a very experimental idea. I can't say it does a lot for privacy, to have such thin walls that are movable. But from a concept side, it's pretty amazing to see spaces transform as they do by just having walls be as fluid as doors. It's a pretty interesting innovation that he used here. I think in this space, you see that kind of reference in how the building is built perpendicular to the hill slope. There's a long rectilinear plan of the building that is kind of broken with these 3 square volumes that are set at 45 degrees from the rectilinear base of the building. And so in those 3 volumes, you have your major program. So one is the bedroom over there, the middle 45-degree volume is the dining room, and this last one is the performance space or the grand living room. But this kind of detail, the sunken living room, the built-in couches, is a little bit different than he's done in other places, but it really, I think, references the fact that she would use this place for recitals. And the built-in storage benches here became seating, as well as where kids stored the music books. The steps themselves became seatings and not just a transitionary. So they didn't just occur in one space, they can accommodate people. The house is an all-plywood house, so it has some structural upkeep needs in terms of just replacing the plywood periodically and some weather exposure that happens there. But generally, it's been very stable. It hasn't settled that much. The doors are original. We've had to replace some of the tracks between the sliding doors, but generally everything's more or less held together pretty well for an 80-year-old house. The house sat very unknown by a lot of the more recent Schindler scholars, basically because when she bought it, she didn't know it was a Schindler, and she discovered it after she had bought it, but she wasn't very active in the design scene, so it didn't really get seen by a lot of people. Kind of sat there vacant and very threatened in some ways. But one person who did recognize the work very importantly was Esther McCoy, who worked for Schindler for a couple of years, I think right around this period, and considers this house like a very important piece of that transitional architecture for him, from his earlier style to his space architecture, as a kind of place where he started having a lot more freedom to express some of his needs. I think the program was somewhat unique. On top of that, the site was somewhat unique. It's actually built on 2 lots. And so whereas a lot of Schindler's houses are very constrained by lot conditions, he had a little bit more freedom to kind of go horizontal on a hillside lot, which was an interesting opportunity for him. And then I think also just the needs of making it work for this kind of performance type space and the acoustical properties, as well as the severe budget limitations of the project, really helped drive some innovation here that he hadn't done before. But this house was built for $6,000, which even in 1938 was a very cheap house. I help run Ravenhill Studio. We're a design firm based in Los Angeles that creates mostly lighting fixtures, but also some small architecture and interior design spaces. But we like to explore how material physics and craft can be used to create a narrative that drives our lighting fixtures. We work primarily with local vendors in and around Los Angeles to make various components that we then bring in-house and assemble in our studio. But our work is really trying to serve architects and designers and kind of plug holes in the market that we see a lack of really good, thoughtful design in. So We do a lot of sconces because there's a seemingly shortage of sconces in the world, good-looking sconces. But we also do a lot of pendants and chandeliers, and occasionally we'll take on a restaurant project or an architecture project as well. The house is filled with African art, which is a legacy that I inherited from my father, who was a museum curator at the Smithsonian Museum, working in the African Art Museum, but he collected African art his adult life and passed away when I was 18, and eventually when we moved out here, we emptied out his storage unit, and so we had all this art that had been sitting there in storage for 20 years, and right around the time that we moved in here. And so the art and the furniture and a lot of pieces that you see are a part of that legacy that I inherited from my father, but strangely work really well with mid-century modern architecture. But a lot of the furniture pieces that we have here are collected from 16th, 17th century African stools and stuff, and having grown up with them throughout my life and then eventually settling out here and bringing them back, that seemed like a nice piece of my childhood that I've managed to carry and share with my family. Also have this kind of weird just echo complement the furniture to the space. We moved into this house in 2012, so we've been here now 13 years. And I don't think a day goes by where I don't appreciate another aspect of this house and its architecture of complex simplicity. Schindler didn't do anything with this house that's mind-boggling from a material perspective of fancy finishes or even any crazy angles or a curve. But somehow using the 90 and 45-degree angle and twisting, pivoting, lifting, orienting it in these different ways, he kind of creates this space that's so much greater than the sum of its parts. And I often just get stuck in these little corners and details where I'm like, these are just 2x4s coming together, but he picked the right 2x4s with the square edges, and he hid the top of the pocket in this beam in these real neat ways where it just ends up feeling these very almost light and airy touch to the whole material. And having a family here and living here, it's wonderful to think how this architecture just helps inspire. I think it's really groundbreaking in its plan and its orientation and its use of space, but it's not doing so while having a giant budget or using fancy materials or using processes that are out of reach for people. It's kind of using the same basic notes but writing this kind of whole new symphony with it. So it's really quite an inspiring space as a designer to see how the mundane materials need not be an excuse for mundane output. You can really use simple things, create great results if you just really are careful about how you put them together.